Hello and welcome to the tiny village of Trouse, just on the very edge of Norwich. Through the trees over there is the City Hall, and I am on the Boudicca Way, which actually starts right up at the train station about a mile or so behind me, but there's been so much traffic I haven't bothered filming any pieces to camera because of all the noise. So the Boudicca Way is a 35-mile long trail, so it starts here in the city of Norwich and ends in the little town of Dis. And it is named so because the queen of the Iceni Tribe that lived in this area, which is an Iron Age tribe, was called Boudicca. And she actually rebelled against the Roman Empire and sent an army south to destroy the city of Colchester. So far I've passed the impressive boom towers, which are two ruined towers of the old city wall just by the River Yare, and I'm going to be passing some lovely historic features later on today's walk. I think I'm going to do about 8 miles or so, 9 miles today, taking the Roman town Caistor St Edmund and also the site of a henge. So I've just entered the parish of Arminghall, and a very interesting monument, and you can't really see much of it, but this slightly raised platform here on my left is actually Arminghall Henge, and this is a particularly interesting monument because it dates to either the Neolithic to Bronze Age period. They actually managed to carbon date some of the charcoal, I think, from inside one of the ditches, and it said between 4,000 and 5,000 years old, which makes it one of the oldest monuments in the county. And during excavations they actually found the post holes from large oaks that kind of went around this ring. Actually, if I come up here I can see the ring. Can you see this very slight mound here as it goes down just in the direction of that pylon, and you can see it curving round here? I never actually expected to be able to see the earthworks. This is really quite amazing. And as I was saying, it's had a bit of a nickname as like a wood henge because it had these massive oak posts all the way round, and likely used for some kind of ceremonial or burial kind of practices back in the Neolithic or Bronze Age. So the Boudicca Way actually circumnavigates around this massive sand quarry. I think it's sand anyway, it looks like that's what they're extracting. But I've got a wonderful view across to County Hall. I can see the spire on top of Norwich Cathedral, and I can see the Roman Catholic Cathedral as well. So I've just joined a little country lane now, and the last few miles have been absolutely fantastic walking. Wide open paths alongside of meadows and just so many insects about, loads and loads of flowers out. It's just been fantastic, and some of the views have been really good as well, even as far back into Norwich. I think I'm about 4.5, nearly 5 miles in, and I'm actually going to do a little out and back section which is still part of the Boudicca Way and actually goes to the old Roman town of Caistor St Edmund. It's called Venta Icenorum, or Venta Icenorum, I think it's Icenorum, and that there's still remains of the Roman town that was there. So I'm going to go and explore that first and then retrace my steps back along the path. So I've finally arrived at Venta Icenorum, which is the ancient Roman town and capital of East Anglia, which is just about 5 miles or so south of Norwich, which is over that way. Now this town actually was built in the first half of the 2nd century, so between 100 and 150 AD. But what's really important is that this is probably the location that the Iceni tribe lived as well before the Romans invaded. And I say Iceni because I've always said Iceni, but according to the information board, it's Iceni, and that's how it's pronounced. So the story goes that when the Roman Empire invaded, the husband of Queen Boudicca actually created an alliance with them so they could live here peacefully. But then upon his death, the alliance actually broke down, and Boudicca eventually revolted against the Roman Empire, and in 61 AD sent an army of people south, burning towns and villages as they go. And the most famous one that they burnt was Colchester at the time, and it was completely razed to the ground. And according to the information boards here, they went as far as London before being defeated. And then, say around the first half of the 2nd century, the Romans built their enormous town here. And the information board actually says that up to 2,000 people lived in this town at one point, and there was a huge vicus, which is a civilian settlement that grew up around it, actually in these fields and all the fields to the east. There's actually a Saxon settlement up there and cemetery as well, which I'm going to pass later. I'm going to take a little different route back. But what's really impressive about this place is that when it is very dry, you can actually see all the Roman roads that crisscross the town, and there are extensive walls and earthworks all the way around in a big square shape, and randomly a medieval church just in one corner. As I mentioned earlier, there's actually a Saxon cemetery, and it is just underneath these trees here. and they were excavated in the 1930s, and over 700 urns were actually discovered, all containing sort of cremated remains, and this is all now designated as a scheduled ancient monument. So we're almost in the village of Upper Stoke, and from there's actually a fairly regular bus service that takes you back into Norwich, so that's the perfect way to go and find some overnight accommodation. Now if that bus isn't running, you can also walk about a mile or so into Porringland, which is over to the east, and again there is a regular bus service back into Norwich for an overnight stay. Good morning and welcome to part 2 of the Boudicca Way, which is going to consist of about 8 or 9 miles of lovely Norfolk countryside. And I've just left Upper Stoke behind me, and we're going to end today at the tiny village of Caistor. And there's actually some really nice historic treats, especially in that village, which I'm really excited to see. I've got a few villages I'm going to pass through, a couple of churches hopefully we can see, and just really looking forward to enjoying this walk as we head south, eventually arriving at Dis in a few days' time. So now in the tiny village of Shottersham, and this wonderful building behind me is the old Duke's Head Inn, and it dates to 1712 and is grade 2 star listed. And opposite, on this awesome little hill here, and it almost looks like a moat going around it, is the Church of All Saints, which is also grade 2 star listed. And this one dates to the medieval period and later, with an awesome 15th century tower, like a skyscraper above the surrounding landscape. It's amazing. So I'm just in the woods here leaving Shottisham and came across this sign, and it's really interesting because there's a big depression behind here and you can easily miss it. But it was actually the impact site of a V2 rocket during World War II. And it says on the 6th of October 1944 at 9:25, that was when the rocket impacted here, narrowly missing the church. This lovely church here is the Church of St Mary the Virgin in Saxtingham, Nethergate, and it's Grade 2 star listed, built in the medieval period, and it has a 15th century tower, just like the previous church that I visited. What's special about this one is that the main fabric is actually sort of 11th century, and you can see a nice defining line most of the way up the wall, which is where it was heightened in the medieval period. And alongside is Old Hall, and it's just behind these trees here. There's a wonderful view down the driveway, and that dates to the first half of the 17th century, and there's also Grade 2 star listed. And it's rare because it's a timber framed house. You don't get many of those in Norfolk. Most of the time they're made out of brick. It's a really, really nice building. So I've just arrived in the little village of Taisborough, and there is one more impressive historic feature to see on this walk, and it might not really look like much right now, but this massive field to my right is actually part of an enclosure, and they've done lots of excavations and surveys of this area, and they proved that this was actually the site of a Saxon settlement. And by looking at the earthworks just near the church, they actually determined that originally it was probably Iron Age or sort of Romano-British, so prehistoric still. And where it is on top of a hill, it's kind of interpreted as being a bit of a hill fort, and then later used as a Saxon settlement. And there's lots of Saxon remains. They've seen post holes and pits and kilns and things like that in this field. And just over here is the church in Taisborough, and this is grade 1 listed, and the tower itself actually dates to the early 11th century, and that is a Saxon tower. So it's likely that this whole enclosure was occupied obviously in the Saxon period, and the church has actually remained in use through those years, and then later added to and adjusted in the early medieval period right through to present day. Good morning and welcome to part 3 of the Boudicca Way, and we started today in Taisborough, just a quarter of a mile or so down that way, and today is going to be about 8 or 8.5 miles, so not too far again. And we're heading today at Fulham Market, which is meant to be a really quite picturesque village, so I'm quite excited to see that. And a lot of today is very, very rural. We're going to pass just a few villages. There is a nature reserve we're going to go through, which is a woodland. Quite excited to go through there and see what birds there are about. And it is also a really hot day today. Forecast was about 20 and cloudy. There's barely a cloud in the sky, and it feels about 24 already at only 20 past 10. So, got to keep hydrated today. So we're just passing through the small village of Fritton, and there's a large area of land just next to me here called Fritton Common, and it's common land, so it's open access land, which means technically I can just wander anywhere I want to go there. There are a few ponds, but they're all dried up because right now we're still in a bit of a heat wave and it hasn't rained for months and months back home. But it's really, really nice. You can actually see like all the nettles are almost dying, It's also worth noting that Fritton doesn't have any amenities, so make sure you bring plenty of food and drink with you. We've now arrived at Tyrrell's Wood Nature Reserve, and this one is owned and managed by Norfolk Wildlife Trust, and it's actually made up of 5 small sections of woodland that all sort of interconnect, and one of them is ancient, with a record showing that it existed in 1251. And there's a lot of wildlife, but I've actually just seen a huge buzzard. It was actually just on the floor down here behind me, and we saw it take off and fly down the path and then up into the trees. And I can hear lots of other woodland birds as well. So I'm certainly going to be keeping a keen eye out and see what I can see. So we've only got about a mile left before we arrive at Pulham Market, and it's taken us about sort of 3.5, nearly 4 hours to get here. I've got this lovely field of uncut barley next to me that's all ready to be harvested, and alongside they've got this lovely strip of wildflowers full of poppies. I think the lavendery coloured one is borage, And there's just so many butterflies and bees all over it. It's wonderful to see. And this whole strip goes all the way around the field. So we're just coming into the village of Pulham Market, and it's quite a historic village. There's lots of listed buildings around, including the Grade 1 listed Church of St Mary Magdalene, which dates to the 14th century. And there's a couple of pubs as well, so there's a few places to get refreshments like the Crown Inn and the Falcon Inn. There's also a regular bus service from the village all the way back to Norwich for an overnight stay. Good morning and welcome back to the Boudicca Way, and this is part 4 and it's the final part of the trail, and I've started at Pulham Market and I'm going to be ending at Diss. So this wonderful building here behind me is the train station here at Pulham Market, and of course, as you can tell, it's closed. It actually closed to the public in 1953 and sadly to freight in 1964. So after travelling for about 7.5 kilometres, finally arrived at my first little village since Puller Market, and this is Shimpling. And there's only a few houses around here, but there is a lovely church. And this church, let me point you up here, it's very, very rare for Norfolk having a spire at the top, but it's pretty old. The round tower and the nave actually date to the 12th century, and the chancel and then the octagonal top date to the 13th century, and it's all Grade 1 listed and dedicated to St George. This lovely isolated building here is the Church of St Andrew in Thelverton, and it sits isolated just amongst lots and lots of open fields. And usually that means that there was either a manor house here that doesn't exist anymore, or there may have been a village here. And what's really interesting is on its northern side, not this side, this is the southern side, there is a Norman archway. Now this building dates to the 15th century mostly, really restored in the 19th century. But that archway predates this building by sort of 400 years, which likely means there was a church here in the Norman period that was then replaced in the medieval period. So I'm now coming up to somewhere called Friends Hall. It could be Frenzy, I'm not quite sure how it's pronounced, but there's a Grade 2 listed house here that dates to the 17th century, and then also a Grade 1 listed chapel of St Andrew that dates to the 14th century, which probably means that, like other places, there was a hall here at the same time this chapel was built that's been demolished and replaced later on in the medieval period. we've finally arrived here at Diss Station, 36 miles since Norwich, and it's blistering 30+ degree heat at the moment, but I can see over here looking at the station. It's been a lovely trail, very rural, not as much Roman history as I would have wanted for a route that is sort of focused on Queen Boudicca, but it has been really, really nice. Plenty of history around Caistor St Edmund and Tasborough, and beyond that just very rural and unspoilt farmland and open countryside. It's been really nice, and this is the perfect place to get the train back to Norwich.